If you close your eyes right now and just try to picture the quote-unquote traditional human family, I mean, the image that pops into your head is almost certainly like a dad heading off to work, right?
His briefcase.
Yeah, the briefcase. And a mom staying home, maybe a couple of kids playing in a nice fenced-in yard. It is completely the default setting of our, our cultural imagination.
Oh, absolutely.
But what if I told you that out of the roughly, I think it's 300,000 years that anatomically modern humans have been walking this earth, that specific isolated family model was only the dominant statistical norm for exactly 15 years.
Wow. Yeah, it completely shatters the baseline we use to, judge our own lives.
Yeah.
Because we've built our entire modern societal expectations around it.
Everything.
Right, our housing, zoning laws, our economic policies, all built around a structure that was essentially a 15-year historical freak occurrence.
A total freak occurrence. And I'm your host, by the way, and joining me is our resident expert. And today, we are going to look really closely at the fallout of that freak occurrence.
Yeah, we've got a lot to get through today.
We really do. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack exactly why the idealized nuclear family, this structure we are constantly told to aspire to, is actually functioning as a profound source of modern misery for you and for so many people.
Right.
We are going to examine the architecture of this isolation, and then we're going to explore what we can actually do about it, looking at solutions that range from the intensely practical to the wildly, provocatively radical.
Yeah, and to map out this terrain, we are drawing heavily on three very distinct, very rigorous sources today.
Right. What do we have?
So first, we have an extensive lecture by the family historian Stephanie Kuntz. And she just meticulously dismantles our nostalgic myths about the history of marriage.
It's so good.
It really is. Second, we're analyzing a major piece from The Atlantic by David Brooks, which tracks the sort of macroeconomic rise and the subsequent inevitable breakdown of the nuclear family.
Right.
And finally, we are examining a deeply challenging interview from the Sacred Podcast with the political theorist Sophie Lewis. And she advocates for a concept known as family abolition and the communization of care.
Okay, so real quick, before we go any further, we need to lay down a very clear marker about the nature of these sources.
Oh, definitely.
Because the material we're covering today, particularly Sophie Lewis's work, it contains heavily opinionated political frameworks. I mean, we are going to be discussing Marxist critiques of global capitalism.
Yes.
We're going to be unpacking radical feminist critiques of patriarchal property laws, as well as, the deep conservative anxieties regarding the breakdown of social order.
Right. And we want to be absolutely clear with you, the listener, right now. Our role here is not to take a side.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing any of these political viewpoints, whether they lean, far left, far right, or sit right in the center. Our objective is entirely impartial analysis.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. We are simply here to synthesize the fascinating historical data and unpack the mechanics of the arguments presented in these texts. Think of us as, your guides walking you through a really complex museum exhibit. We're pointing out the architecture of the ideas, not telling you what to buy in the gift shop.
That's a great way to put it. So if the 1950s nuclear family is just a 15-year statistical anomaly, the immediate question is, well, what was the human race doing for the thousands of years prior?
Right.
Because if we're going to understand why the current system is making people so miserable, we have to understand what it actually replaced. And David Brooks's analysis starts by looking at the raw economic reality of human history.
Yeah.
And it paints a picture of survival that required, frankly, a lot more hands on deck.
Yeah, Brooks brings up agricultural data that really grounds this whole conversation.
Yeah.
Because in 1875, which is just over a century and a half ago, 75% of the American workforce was engaged in farming.
75%.
Yeah, and a massive chunk of the remaining 25% were working in small, localized, family-run trades. So when 3/4 of your population is physically working the dirt for survival, the concept of a closed-off two-parent nuclear family is just...
It's impossible.
the physical and economic impossibility.
Yeah, because you literally couldn't generate enough calories to survive.
Precisely. A family in that era was not primarily an emotional unit designed for psychological fulfillment.
Right. It wasn't about finding your soulmate.
No, it was a firm. It was an economic enterprise.
Yeah.
And to run that enterprise, you needed sprawling, extended kinship networks living and working in incredibly close proximity. So you're talking grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, cousins.
The whole village.
They were all essential laborers in this collective survival unit.
Which fundamentally rewrites the role of women in the so-called traditional era. I mean, Stephanie Coontz makes a point in her lecture that completely upends that 1950s housewife stereotype.
Oh, completely.
Because in the colonial era, the idea of a male, quote-unquote, breadwinner and a female homemaker simply did not exist. Women were entirely understood to be economic co-providers.
Right. Kuntz notes that colonial women were often legally and socially referred to as yoke mates.
Wow, yoke mates.
Think about the physical reality of that term. You yoke two oxen together to pull a heavy plow through hardened earth. The labor is equally distributed because, well, the cart doesn't move otherwise.
Yeah.
These women were not relegated to, like, decorative domesticity.
They weren't just, arranging flowers and baking pies all day. Kuntz details how they were clearing brush, they were brewing beer for caloric intake, raising livestock. I mean, they were literally butchering pigs to drag the salted meat to the market. The colonial household was a functioning factory. They produced their own soap, their own candles, their own clothing. If a woman had somehow decided, hey, I'm just going to be a stay-at-home mom who only focuses on child rearing, the family would have literally starved to death by December.
Yeah, the survival of the entire network depended on this grueling shared physical labor. The cultural ideal of a man leaving the home to earn a specialized wage, while a woman remains in this, like, pristine, unwaged domestic sphere.
Right.
That only began to emerge as a concept during the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. And even then, it was an exclusive luxury.
Oh, yeah, for the rich.
Only a tiny fraction of the wealthiest Victorian industrialists could actually afford to live that way.
Right, because if you were working class or poor in, say, the 1920s, maybe the mother was staying home, but that was often only because the family was sending their 8-year-old children into the textile mills to make up the lost income.
Which is horrifying.
It is. The math just never worked for the average person. So how do we get to the 1950s? How did this Ozzie and Harriet model, the dad in the suit, the mom in the apron, the kids in the pristine suburban home, how did that suddenly become the attainable standard for a massive chunk of the population?
Well, it wasn't a return to some historical biological default, that's for sure.
Right.
It was the result of a highly specific, unrepeatable macroeconomic bubble. We have to look at the global landscape immediately following World War II.
Huh.
In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the United States emerged with its manufacturing infrastructure not only intact but massively expanded by the war effort.
Yeah, the war machine just turned into a consumer machine.
Right. Meanwhile, the rest of the industrialized world, Europe, Japan, Russia, had literally been bombed to rubble.
Wow. So the U.S. essentially had a temporary total monopoly on global manufacturing.
Combine that global monopoly with intense domestic policies. You had incredibly high union density, which forced corporations to distribute those massive profits down to the workers in the form of high wages, robust pensions, ironclad job security.
Stuff that's just unheard of today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Plus, you had the GI Bill heavily subsidizing mortgages and education, though we must note primarily for white families, which created severe racial wealth disparities.
Oh, huge caveat, yes.
Right. And you had top marginal tax rates over 80%, funding massive public infrastructure, like the interstate highway system, which essentially birthed the suburbs.
So this perfect storm of zero global competition, aggressive union power, and massive government subsidies created a freakish window of economic abundance.
Yeah.
And for the first and only time in human history, it became mathematically possible for a single working-class earner with just a high school diploma to fully support a household, buy a detached home, 2 cars, and send kids to college.
It's wild to think about. The economy was so artificially supercharged that it essentially subsidized the isolation of the nuclear family.
Oh, that's a great point.
People could afford to physically move away from their extended kinship networks. Leaving the grandparents in the city to move to a cul-de-sac in the suburbs because they no longer needed the extended family for economic survival. The high wages basically replaced the village.
But Kuntz's lecture goes deeper than just the economics of the 1950s. She dismantles our nostalgia regarding the actual structure of families in the past.
Yes, she does.
Because if you look at modern political discourse, you constantly hear that single-parent homes and step-families are a sign of modern moral decay, like a deviation from tradition. But Kuntz points out that historically, stepfamilies were the absolute norm.
And we have to understand the mechanics of why they were the norm. It wasn't because of, like, a high cultural tolerance for divorce.
No.
It was driven entirely by staggering mortality rates. Kuntz highlights a terrifying demographic reality. At the beginning of the 19th century, the vast majority of marriages were ended by death a full 10 years before the youngest child was old enough to leave home.
That is a brutal statistic. I mean, you are in the middle of raising your family, and your spouse simply dies of cholera or childbirth, or like an infected cut on their hand.
And because the family was an economic survival firm, a widow or widower couldn't just mourn for 5 years.
Right.
You couldn't run the farm alone. You had to replace that labor immediately. So constant, rapid remarriage was a survival imperative. Society was absolutely flooded with blended families, half-siblings, and step-parents.
And Kuntz points out that the internal dynamics of these historical stepfamilies were often incredibly fraught, like way more than they are today.
Oh, yeah.
She uses the fairy tale of Cinderella to illustrate this. We treat the wicked stepmother as just a cartoon trope now, but Kuntz argues it was rooted in deep, legitimate historical anxiety.
Right, because in a world where survival depends on inheriting the physical property, so
Yeah.
the farm, the tools, the livestock, the arrival of a new spouse who has their own biological children creates an immediate literal threat to the resources of the first batch of kids.
It's a zero-sum game for survival.
Exactly. The fear that a step-parent might actively scheme to disinherit or even cause the demise of the previous children so their own bloodline could secure the property. That was a very real, very common anxiety in early modern Europe.
So a modern teenager complaining that their new stepdad is trying too hard to enforce curfew doesn't quite compare to the historical fear that your stepmother is trying to slowly poison your porridge so her biological son gets the title to the farm.
Right. The pressures were entirely existential. And Kuntz also takes a sledgehammer to the idea that high divorce rates are a uniquely modern, uniquely Western phenomenon caused by, like, secularism.
Her global tour of historical divorce practices is fascinating. It turns out human beings have always found ways to formally abandon each other when things get miserable.
Yeah, she cites several cultures where the mechanics of divorce were highly streamlined. In the Shoshone Native American tribes, the process for a woman to initiate a divorce was essentially the original no-fault system.
No lawyers needed.
Right, she didn't need a judge. She would simply gather her husband's personal possessions and leave them in the dirt outside their dwelling.
I love that.
And when he returned and saw his belongings outside, the marriage was legally and culturally dissolved.
Incredibly efficient. And she brings up historical Japan, where
Yeah.
a man could execute a divorce simply by drafting a letter that was culturally mandated to be exactly 3.5 lines long.
Yeah.
It was essentially a divorce haiku. Once handed over, the contract was severed.
But perhaps the most revealing anecdote Kuntz offers is regarding the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. We historically associate the medieval church with this absolute, uncompromising prohibition on divorce. The theological stance was, what God has joined, let no man put asunder.
Right. But the reality of the nobility was entirely different. The upper classes used marriage exclusively as a geopolitical tool. They married to merge estates, secure borders, consolidate wealth, and to keep the wealth in a tight circle, they constantly married their cousins. Now, at the same time, the church had codified incredibly expansive definitions of incest, known as consanguinity laws. If you were related within the 7th degree, marriage was forbidden.
Which, given the closed loops of medieval nobility, meant that virtually every single royal or noble marriage in Europe was technically incestuous.
Everyone shared a great-great-great-grandparent.
Everyone. The church knew this, the nobles knew this, and everyone just ignored it to facilitate the property mergers.
Until they needed an out.
Right.
Kuntz explains that when the political winds change, say your wife's family lost their army or you just despised her and wanted a new alliance, you couldn't get a divorce, but you could suddenly have an overwhelming crisis of faith.
Oh, the convenience.
A nobleman would go to the bishop and say, "Father, my conscience is in agony. I have just done the genealogical math and I am horrified to discover my wife is my 7th cousin. We are living in sin." And the church, understanding the political game, would grant an annulment.
It was a massive socially sanctioned loophole that allowed for serial monogamy and political realignment, all disguised as religious piety. It proves that the institution of marriage has always bent to the economic and political needs of the people in power.
So if we synthesize all of this, If the historical baseline is actually sprawling extended networks, women operating as heavy lifting economic co-providers, households constantly fracturing and reforming due to brutal mortality rates, and institutions bending rules to allow for property consolidation.
Yeah.
Then, our modern attempt to force everyone into the mold of the 1950s isolated nuclear family is completely untethered from human history.
It's like insisting that a specific type of scaffolding used briefly to build a single monument in the 1950s is the only valid way to build any structure, anywhere, forever.
Right. Let's use a technology analogy here because I think it maps perfectly onto how systems become obsolete. Is the 1950s nuclear family basically the socioeconomic equivalent of a flip phone?
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, in 2004, the flip phone was a brilliant piece of hardware. It perfectly matched the specific needs and technological constraints of that exact moment. But what happens if you try to run modern software on it today?
The analogy holds up incredibly well. If you try to run the heavy, demanding software of modern life, so dual income career expectations, modern intensive parenting standards, complex logistical scheduling, and our modern expectations of deep emotional intimacy on the isolated, low bandwidth hardware of a 1950s flip phone, the system completely crashes.
Yeah.
The battery dies immediately, the processor overheats.
Which brings us to the core argument of this deep dive. If this nuclear hardware is obsolete, but we are culturally and economically forced to keep using it, what is the result? The sources argue the result is the architecture of misery.
Yes.
The nuclear family structure is no longer just quaint, it is actively breaking people. So let's examine the mechanics of why it fails us so profoundly today.
Well, the central flaw in the architecture is that it creates a massive bottleneck for human support. By its very design, it walls off a tiny group of people from the broader community and places an impossible, crushing burden of care on just one or two adults.
Let's look at how this bottleneck creates severe economic and class strain, drawing on David Brooks. Because when the artificial economic bubble of the 1950s popped, when wages stagnated in the 70s and 80s, manufacturing moved overseas, and the cost of housing and education skyrocketed, the impact of the nuclear family's isolation became highly stratified by class.
Because the unpaid labor didn't disappear.
No.
Historically, the extended village provided a massive amount of free labor. Grandparents watched the toddlers, aunts helped with elder care, neighbors pitched in with home maintenance. The village was an informal social safety net. When we moved into isolated suburban boxes, we severed that net.
So how do working class and lower income families survive today? They don't have the village and they don't have the post-war high wages. Brooks points out they are forced to internalize all that labor. Working class parents are trying to be the entire village themselves while simultaneously working multiple jobs just to pay the rent. The math is brutal. It leads to chronic stress, latchkey kids, and structural poverty. The isolation acts as an economic anchor.
Conversely, how do affluent families manage the exact same loss of the village? They don't change the nuclear family structure, they simply commodify the village. Brooks notes that wealthy households use their surplus capital to buy extended kinship networks on the open market.
They patch the holes in the nuclear ship with paid labor. If the grandparents aren't around, you hire a $60,000 a year nanny. You buy tutors to handle the educational labor. You hire housekeepers to do the domestic labor. You hire therapists to do the emotional labor.
Exactly. The wealthy are able to maintain the aesthetic illusion of the independent nuclear family only because they secretly outsource the actual burden of care to an invisible army of gig workers and service professionals.
Right.
If you cannot afford to buy that shadow village, you are left completely adrift in the nuclear box.
But the misery isn't just about modern economic strain. It is deeply embedded in the historical legal architecture of the institution itself. Stephanie Kuntz's lecture dives into the actual legal mechanics of traditional marriage, and it is a stark reminder that this institution was fundamentally designed as a mechanism of control, particularly for women.
Yes, we have to look at the legal doctrine of coverture, which was the foundational bedrock of Anglo-American marriage law for centuries.
It's so dark.
It really is. Under coverture, a woman's legal identity literally evaporated the moment she said, "I do." The legal phrasing Kuntz cites is chilling in its clarity. Husband and wife are one, and that one is the husband.
That wasn't a metaphor. It was literal legal absorption. So how did coverture actually function in daily life?
Well, a married woman could not sign a contract. She could not draft a will without her husband's explicit consent. She could not sue or be sued. If she worked and earned wages, those wages legally belonged entirely to her husband. If she brought inherited property into the marriage, the husband gained total control over its management and profits. She was legally categorized alongside infants and the mentally incompetent as someone unable to manage her own existence.
And this total legal and financial subjugation inevitably extended into physical autonomy. Because if you legally absorb a person, you own their body. Kuntz points out that historically, a man had the absolute legal right to physically restrain and correct his wife.
She highlights a darkly absurd piece of municipal legislation from 16th century London. The city council passed a law regarding wife beating, but the law did not criminalize the act.
This is unbelievable.
The regulation merely stipulated that a man was not allowed to beat his wife after 9:00 p.m.
Because the screaming would wake the neighbors and disturb the peace.
Exactly.
The law wasn't protecting the woman's body, it was protecting the neighborhood's sleep schedule.
Yeah.
That is the exact level of protection the traditional architecture provided.
And we cannot write this off as ancient medieval history. Kuntz reminds us that the legal echoes of coverture lasted well into our own lifetimes. The concept of marital rape, the idea that a husband could be charged with sexually assaulting his wife, was not universally criminalized in all 50 states in America until the early 1990s.
Let that sink in. For most of American history, the legal definition of marriage dictated that by saying "I do" at the altar, a woman provided irrevocable lifelong consent to sex under any and all circumstances, and the state had no right to intervene.
Yeah.
So when politicians or cultural commentators express a deep nostalgia for traditional marriage, they are wittingly or unwittingly longing for a legal scaffolding where one half of the partnership was essentially classified as property.
And this concept of the home as a site of exploitation and extraction brings us directly to the perspective of the political theorist Sophie Lewis. This is where the critique of the nuclear family moves past historical legalities and enters a systemic critique of modern capitalism.
Lewis doesn't look at the family as a romantic haven in a heartless world. She looks at it as what she calls a technology of work. She argues that the entire structure of the nuclear family is custom designed to serve the needs of a capitalist economy by relying on the unpaid, invisible, and depleting labor of women.
Think about the mechanics of the workforce. For a factory, an office, or a corporation to generate profit, the workers must show up every day, relatively rested, fed, clothed, and mentally stable enough to do their jobs.
Right.
But capitalism doesn't pay for the immense amount of labor required to produce that rested worker.
Who does the laundry? Who cooks the meals? Who emotionally regulates the exhausted worker after a 12-hour shift? Who bears and raises the next generation of future workers?
Historically, it was the unpaid housewife.
Right.
Lewis argues that the nuclear family is the specific mechanism capitalism uses to extract all this essential care labor for free. If corporations had to pay a market rate for the domestic labor required to keep their workforce alive, the profit margins of capitalism would collapse.
And Lewis makes a crucial, very modern point. This extraction didn't end when women entered the formal workforce en masse in the late 20th century. We like to think, well, women have careers now, so the 1950s housewife trap is gone. But Lewis points out that the extraction simply doubled.
Yeah, the suicidality of the housewife, the profound, suffocating despair of being trapped in isolated domestic labor that persists in modern dual-income households.
Why?
Because the architecture of the isolated home hasn't changed. Women are now working a grueling 40-hour wage job and then coming home to a second shift of unwaged domestic labor because the isolated house still requires cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing, and the village still doesn't exist.
This isn't just abstract Marxist theory for Lewis. In The Sacred Interview, she grounds these concepts in deeply painful personal reality. She traces her entire political and theoretical awakening back to the structural misery she witnessed in her own childhood home.
It's a very heavy part of the interview. Lewis describes her mother, a German woman who was highly intelligent, capable, and politically aware. Yet she ended up funneled into this traditional, isolated nuclear diet.
Right.
And the sheer pressure of that isolation broke her. Lewis talks about her mother suffering from severe depression, battling alcoholism, and experiencing persistent suicidality.
Lewis observes that her mother realized the fundamental deal of modern parenthood, the dyadic model, two parents alone in a private household bearing the entire weight of raising humans. It's simply cannot work. It is structurally flawed.
Yeah.
And her mother, in Lewis's harrowing phrasing, preferred the idea of annihilating herself over continuing to exist in a structure that was suffocating her life force.
And think about the mechanics of how that isolation affects a child.
Hmm.
When the nuclear bottleneck means a child's entire emotional and physical survival depends on one or two people, and those people are collapsing under the strain, the child has no external safety net.
None.
Lewis says her own survival mechanism was to essentially become a runaway.
She became an aggressive overachiever. She got herself accepted into Oxford as a queer teenager, essentially to escape the trauma of the nuclear pressure cooker.
Right.
When you understand that backstory, you realize her radical theories aren't coming from a place of academic malice or a desire to destroy love. They are born from a desperate, trauma-informed desire to build a societal architecture where someone like her mother wouldn't be driven to the brink of death by the sheer isolation of a suburban home.
Exactly.
Okay, let me pause and push back on this narrative for a moment because it feels like we're leaving out the biggest cultural shift of the last 2 centuries.
Okay.
Well, we've established that traditional marriage was an economic property contract, and we see how the modern nuclear isolation creates a pressure cooker. But society evolved. We had the Enlightenment, we introduced poetry, romance, and the concept of marrying for love. Didn't the invention of falling in love fix the brutality of the institution? Didn't love make the nuclear family better?
It is exactly the question we have been conditioned to ask. If the rigid rules and the property laws were the problem, surely the introduction of deep, authentic romance was the cure.
Right.
But this is where Stephanie Kuntz's research reveals a magnificent, highly counterintuitive paradox. The invention of the love match did not save the traditional family. It was the exact explosive device that destroyed its stability forever.
The idea that love is the dynamite that blew up traditional marriage is completely fascinating. Let's unpack the mechanics of this paradox. How did the love match actually happen?
Kuntz traces it back about 200 years. Driven by the philosophical shifts of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the American Revolution's focus on the pursuit of happiness, society began to adopt a genuinely radical, unprecedented idea that a young man and a young woman should choose their own spouses based primarily on mutual affection and emotional compatibility.
Which, against the backdrop of history, is a wildly destabilizing concept. For thousands of years, marriage was about acquiring in-laws, brokering peace treaties between warring tribes, or merging adjacent farms.
Exactly.
You didn't cancel a treaty because the ambassadors didn't feel butterflies when they looked at each other. But suddenly, the culture starts suggesting that the ultimate metric for a valid marriage is whether it makes your heart flutter.
And this philosophical shift achieved exactly what you would expect on a purely interpersonal level. It made marriage as an internal relationship infinitely better.
Oh, for sure.
When it functions properly, a modern love match based on mutual respect, passion, and shared values is fairer, deeper, and more emotionally fulfilling than anything our medieval or colonial ancestors could have ever dared to imagine.
But, and this is the crux of Kuntz's paradox-making marriage, a better relationship made it a far weaker institution.
We have to look at the sociological mechanics of institutions. Strong, lasting institutions require rigid, unbending rules. They operate on duty, obligation, and external enforcement.
Right.
A strong institution does not care if you are having a bad day or if you feel emotionally unfulfilled. The rigidity is the exact thing that makes the institution stable over centuries. But what makes a strong relationship?
It's the exact opposite qualities. A strong relationship requires extreme flexibility. It requires constant negotiation, fairness, compromise, and the ability to radically adapt as both individuals grow and change over decades.
Precisely. And those exact qualities, flexibility, the demand for fairness, the pursuit of personal fulfillment, are incredibly corrosive to an institution that was originally built to force people to do exactly what they were told forever, regardless of their misery.
Wait, so when this idea of marrying for love was first introduced in the 18th and 19th centuries, what was the reaction of the establishment?
Kuntz notes that social conservatives of the era were absolutely terrified. They wrote frantic pamphlets and essays warning against the love match. And the incredible irony of history is that the conservative alarmists were entirely 100% correct in their predictions.
They saw it coming.
They understood the structural threat of romance better than the progressives did.
What did they predict would happen?
They looked at the logic of the love match and said, if you tell young people that the only valid moral reason to enter a marriage is because they are deeply in love, what is going to happen when they inevitably fall out of love?
Right.
They predicted that making love the foundation would inevitably, mathematically, lead to widespread demands for divorce.
Because if the love is gone, the justification for the institution's existence is gone.
Exactly. Furthermore, They predicted the love match would inexorably lead to demands for women's equality within the home. Because how can you claim to be deeply spiritually in love with someone whom the law classifies as your literal property?
You can't.
Love requires seeing the other person as a sovereign equal, which destroys the hierarchy of coverture.
They even predicted it would undermine the entire concept of illegitimacy. If love is the highest moral good, how can you legally or socially punish a child born out of wedlock if that child was born from a genuine romance? The conservatives saw that the acid of love would eat through the chains of duty and control. It just took about 150 years for the cultural infrastructure, things like reliable birth control and women's ability to earn independent wages, to catch up with the philosophy and fully break the institution open in the 1970s.
So love made the cage beautiful, but it eventually unlocked the door. However, if we bring Sophie Lewis's theoretical framework back into this discussion, she argues that the door isn't as open as we think it is.
How so?
Because even though we introduced love and romance, we never fully eradicated the foundational concept of ownership.
This is a dense, deeply unsettling concept. Lewis argues that the property form, the cold logic of capitalism and ownership, still heavily infects how we love each other today. What does she actually mean when she says we still view our partners and our children as property?
She means that under the current architecture of the nuclear family, our love remains heavily conditional, proprietary, and territorial. Listen to our language. We say, my wife, my husband, my child. And we don't just mean it as a statement of relation. We often mean it as a statement of exclusive possession.
Wow.
We believe that by virtue of marriage or biology, we possess a right to control, surveil, and dictate the lives of the people inside our nuclear unit in ways we would never dream of imposing on a close friend.
We treat the nuclear family like a gated community. The emotional care, the financial resources, the physical protection, it is all hoarded aggressively inside the walls of the house.
Yes.
And Lewis argues this property logic is particularly stark and particularly damaging in how we view children. In our culture, we view children as the literal exclusive property of their biological parents.
And to unpack the implications of this, the interview wades into some of the most controversial territory imaginable, the commercial surrogacy industry.
Lewis wrote a book titled Full Surrogacy Now, and the moment people hear that title, their minds immediately jump to dystopian sci-fi.
Oh, immediately.
They picture The Handmaid's Tale. They assume she's advocating for massive corporate womb farms where women are exploited to breed children for the rich, but that is fundamentally misreading her argument.
Lewis is actually a fierce critic of the current commercial surrogacy industry.
Yeah.
She acknowledges that in a capitalist system, surrogacy is rife with profound economic coercion and physical exploitation of poor women.
Right.
However, she warns against the reflexive reaction of both traditional conservatives and many mainstream feminists who look at surrogacy and say, this is an evil technological disruption of the sacred, natural, traditional family. We must defend biological motherhood.
Gee, shouldn't we say that? It seems like a natural defense against corporate exploitation.
Yeah. Because, Lewis argues, if you attack surrogacy by romanticizing natural biological motherhood, you are accidentally reinforcing the very institution that has been extracting unpaid labor from women for centuries. You are defending the unwaged workplace of the home.
You are reinforcing the idea that women are naturally, biologically destined to bear the entire burden of care.
Exactly. Lewis argues that surrogacy, as uncomfortable and exploitative as it currently is, reveals a profound, inconvenient truth about human existence. It strips away the romantic mythology and reveals that all reproduction and all human survival is fundamentally assisted.
There is a quote in the interview from a radical midwife that Lewis cites, and it cuts right to the bone, whose reproduction is not assisted.
None of us create ourselves in a vacuum. A biological mother does not build a child alone. We are shaped and co-produced by expansive networks. The doctors, the agricultural workers who provide the food supply, the community infrastructure, the cultural environment.
And more radically, Lewis is arguing that the mere presence of your DNA in a fetus does not grant you sovereign ownership over a human soul.
Right.
Just because a child is made of your genetic material does not mean they belong to you in the way a car or house belongs to you.
She states that children belong to all of us, perhaps, but they belong to no one but themselves. That is a massive tectonic paradigm shift.
It really is.
It attacks the very root code of the nuclear family, which operates on the premise, these are my biological offspring, I own them, I am solely responsible for their outcomes, and the rest of society has no say and no obligation.
If we follow Lewis's logic, if we refuse to critique that biological property relation, we can never actually dismantle the exploitations of capitalism because our most intimate relationships are still built on the foundational idea of owning other human beings.
So we arrive at the culmination of the diagnosis. The architecture of the isolated nuclear family creates severe economic bottlenecks. It legally, historically subjugated women. It extracts massive amounts of unpaid labor under the guise of natural duty. And it infects our deepest loves with the toxic logic of property and ownership.
Which means we are treating our homes like fortresses. We lock the deadbolts at night. We hoard all our exhausted care inside. We try to meet every single psychological and physical need of the people inside those walls, and we quietly drown under the pressure.
Yeah.
So if the gated community is the source of the misery, how do we tear down the gates?
This transitions us into the most radical, provocative proposition found in our sources. If the architecture is fundamentally flawed, Sophie Lewis argues, we cannot just tinker with the wallpaper. We must execute a concept she calls family abolition.
And let's be honest, that phrase is a public relations nightmare. When people hear family abolition, they instantly bristle.
It sounds viscerally terrifying.
It sounds like the state kicking in your door and taking your children away. It invokes images of Stalinist orphanages or Maoist cultural revolutions. So let's really dig into what to do about it, part 1. Utopias and family abolition. We need to explain the actual mechanics of what she means because it is not about destruction.
Elizabeth Oldfield, the host of The Sacred Podcast, had that exact same fearful reaction. But Lewis clarifies that the term abolition, when used in this specific philosophical and political tradition, does not mean destroy by fire.
Right.
It does not mean forcibly separating people who love each other or outlawing biological bonds.
It means to supersede.
Yes. The methodology of abolition is actually an act of deep empathy. You look at an oppressive institution, and instead of just attacking it, you ask, what is the profound, legitimate human need that this broken institution is desperately trying to meet?
Let's use an analogy to make this concrete, because Lewis draws heavily from the prison abolition movement. If you are a serious prison abolitionist, your platform isn't just, let's blow up the brick walls tomorrow and let violent offenders run free.
That would be chaos.
Right. You start by acknowledging a core truth. Society has a profound, legitimate need for safety. Human beings need to be protected from harm.
Right. The need for safety is real. But then the abolitionist asks the critical question. Is the current prison industrial complex actually meeting that need for safety? Or is it a massive machine that perpetuates trauma, generates recidivism, and exports violence back into the community?
And the data shows.
When the data shows it's the latter, you don't just paint the prison cells a nicer color. You look to supersede the prison. You build new community infrastructures, massive investments in mental health, economic rehabilitation, restorative justice that meet the human need for safety so much more effectively that the prison itself becomes obsolete. You build a reality where you no longer need the cage.
So how do we apply that exact methodology to the family? What is the profound, legitimate human need the nuclear family is trying to meet? It is the absolute foundational human need for care.
Yes.
The need for physical safety, for deep emotional belonging, for unconditional love. It's the fantasy, as Lewis articulates it, that blood is thicker than water and that you will always have a sanctuary where you are held no matter what.
It is a beautiful, necessary utopian promise. But as we've seen, the isolated nuclear family consistently fails to deliver on that promise. Or it only delivers it to the wealthy, while extracting a massive toll of exhaustion and despair from everyone else.
Right.
Therefore, family abolition means acknowledging the desperate need for care and actively building a societal architecture that provisions it for everyone, completely unlinking survival from biological luck.
It is what Lewis calls the communization of care, moving from a societal model based on the accumulation of private wealth to a model based on the radical diffusion of care. But let's get out of the philosophical clouds for a second.
Let's do it.
What does the communization of care actually look like physically? How does it change the geography of how we live?
In Lewis's post-capitalist vision, it requires breaking down the physical architecture of the single-family home. She envisions larger communal living compounds, not barren state-run dormitories, but vibrant, architecturally beautiful spaces designed to share the immense logistical burden of daily life.
It's about shared infrastructure. Think about your own street right now for a second. If you live in a suburb, how many private washing machines are sitting idle 90% of the time?
Oh, almost all of them.
How many lawnmowers are resting in individual garages? Why does every single house require an isolated kitchen where one exhausted parent is chopping onions for 3 people every single night? It is a massive, irrational duplication of labor and resources.
Lewis suggests we design for collective eating spaces where cooking is a shared, rotating community effort, shared high-quality laundry facilities, expansive communal areas for childcare and leisure.
It makes so much sense.
It is about intentionally designing architecture where care is diffused across a network of 50 or 100 people rather than concentrated entirely on the shoulders of 2 isolated parents.
We often hear the cliche, it takes a village to raise a child. But over the last century, we systematically bulldozed the village to build the cul-de-sac.
We really did.
Lewis is saying we have to deliberately, consciously rebuild the village. And to do that, we have to fundamentally alter the psychology of how we relate to one another. Which brings us to the concept of red love.
This is a fascinating concept drawn from the dissident left of the Bolshevik tradition, heavily championed by early 20th century thinkers like Alexandra Kollontai. Red love, or comradeliness, is the attempt to love someone completely devoid of the contamination of property ownership.
It is the absolute rejection of the romantic tropes we are fed by pop culture. It is rejecting the idea of you complete me, or you are mine. Lewis defines red love in a way that is incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
She says true love is the act of seeking a person's maximal autonomy while simultaneously ensuring their maximal immersion in care.
And in Western capitalism, we view those two concepts, autonomy and care, as mutually exclusive opposites. We are taught that freedom means radical individualism, being a lone wolf, needing no one.
Right.
And we are taught that care means being tied down, burdened by heavy obligations. But the abolitionist tradition insists this is a false dichotomy. You cannot have one without the other.
Lewis uses the phrase, we are each other's freedom. Let's unpack the mechanics of that. You cannot be truly autonomous. You cannot reach your highest potential if you are constantly terrified of starving, or if you are isolated and severely depressed.
Exactly.
True freedom only emerges when you are so massively supported, so deeply held by a web of communal care, that you have the psychological and physical safety to actually pursue your own actualization.
And crucially, this concept of diffuse care extends to the children. During the interview, Lewis invokes a quote from the great American writer James Baldwin. Baldwin said, "The children are all ours."
It is a radical rejection of the idea that my moral responsibility ends at the property line of my front yard.
Yes.
If we acknowledge that we are all co-producers of society, then every child's welfare, every child's education, every child's hunger is my direct concern, not just the kids who share my DNA.
Adopting this mindset completely shifts how we view the concept of utopia. When we hear utopia, we usually think of it the way Thomas More described it in the 16th century, as an island you sail to, a final, static destination where all problems are solved.
Right, a magical land.
But Lewis argues that utopia is not a noun. It is a verb.
She quotes the Zapatista indigenous movement in Mexico, who describe utopia as a world made by walking. Utopia is the method. It is the daily insurgency against the isolation of modern life. It is the daily practice of choosing solidarity, of cooking a meal for a neighbor, of expanding your circle of care just 1 inch further than capitalism tells you is necessary.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to step in here and offer some heavy practical pushback.
Bring it on.
Because listening to this vision of a beloved, communized community, it sounds deeply moving. It sounds almost sacred, but let's be fiercely realistic. If communizing care requires massive communal infrastructure, historically, efforts to engineer collective living on a large scale have often required immense state bureaucracy, which frequently morphs into authoritarian overreach.
That is a highly valid historical critique.
Furthermore, if I am a listener, commuting to a job I can't afford to quit, stressed about paying an inflated mortgage, worried about getting my kids to soccer practice, and I haven't slept a full 8 hours in 5 years. How do I actually apply this? Is family abolition just a beautiful, poetic theory from Marxist academics that has zero utility for a working-class parent on a Tuesday night?
It is the exact right question to ask, and it's the necessary pivot for this deep dive. The grand utopian vision is incredibly useful for giving us a philosophical true north of direction to march toward. But you are right, it does not cook dinner on Tuesday.
Nope.
Fortunately, our stack of sources does not leave us stranded in the realm of high theory. We can transition from Lewis's radical systemic critique to the immediate, highly practical, on-the-ground steps offered by David Brooks and Stephanie Kuntz. Let's move into What to Do About It, Part 2. chosen families and practical reforms.
Because the one foundational truth that all three of these incredibly diverse sources agree upon is this: we cannot go backward. The conservative fantasy of shoving society back into the 1950s model is a logistical impossibility. Stephanie Kuntz makes a brilliant comparison to the Industrial Revolution to explain this.
Yeah, when the Industrial Revolution swept across the globe,
Yeah.
it was incredibly violent and disruptive. It destroyed centuries-old agrarian ways of life. It displaced millions of farmers and crammed them into brutal, dangerous urban factories.
It was awful.
But, as Kuntz points out, you couldn't look at the horrors of the early factories and say, well, this is terrible. Let's just shut down all the steam engines and force millions of people back onto subsistence farms. The technological and economic change was permanent.
You couldn't uninvent the machine. You had to look at the new reality and ask, how do we reform this?
Yeah.
How do we minimize the massive losses like child labor and lethal factory conditions while building on the genuine gains like mass production, medicine, and eventually rising living standards?
Kuntz argues that the shift in family dynamics over the last 50 years is exactly the same magnitude of change. It is a worldwide, irreversible sociological revolution.
Yeah.
Women have entered the global workforce. Reliable birth control has severed the biological imperative of constant reproduction, and the legal right to divorce is widely accessible. The genie is out of the bottle. We must adapt by expanding our definitions and reforming our policies to support the complex reality we actually inhabit, rather than punishing people for failing to live up to a nostalgic fantasy.
And David Brooks provides the immediate ground-level blueprint for this adaptation: the cultivation of the chosen family. He steps back and looks at the global data, pointing out that even today, the isolated nuclear family isn't the norm for most of humanity.
No, it really isn't.
38% of the global population still lives in robust, extended families.
He cites the example of Gambia in West Africa, where the average household size is 13.7 people living in interconnected compounds. Or look at Mexico, where sprawling kinship networks can involve 50 to 70 people living in close proximity, pooling resources, and sharing childcare.
But what do we do in America or the UK, where the modern economy has forced us to scatter across the continent in pursuit of jobs, completely physically severing those biological networks?
Well, if you lack biological support, or if your biological family is toxic and unsafe, you have to forge your own kinship. Brooks highlights how the modern concept of the chosen family really gained cultural and logistical prominence in the 1980s, specifically within the gay and lesbian communities in cities like San Francisco.
This is a vital piece of history. You had an entire generation of queer people who had been cast adrift, frequently disowned, and legally rejected by their biological nuclear families. They were floating in the world, and then they were hit by the apocalyptic crisis of the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
The state abandoned them, and their biological families often refused to claim them. So they came together and made a radical declaration: we will be a family.
And they didn't just use the word family as a cute metaphor for a friend group. They built hard, logistical infrastructure. They set up medical proxies and power of attorney for each other. They pooled their finances to pay each other's rent when someone got sick.
Wow.
They built expansive underground hospice networks to bathe and feed the dying. They provided the deep, sustaining life-or-death support that the biological nuclear family is theoretically supposed to provide, but it utterly failed to do for them.
Brooks is arguing that this model of the chosen family is no longer just a survival tactic for marginalized communities. It has become an absolute logistical necessity for everyone in the modern economy. We have to stop treating our close friends and our neighbors as casual weekend acquaintances.
Right.
We have to start treating them as vital, necessary infrastructure. We have to actively invite them into the messy, unglamorous daily logistics of our lives.
However, chosen families and mutual aid networks, while beautiful and necessary, cannot fix massive structural macroeconomic problems on their own. This is where Stephanie Kuntz brings in the demand for hard policy reforms.
Yep.
If the nuclear family is fundamentally cracking under the weight of modern capitalism, the state and the workplace must step in to carry some of the load.
We need practical legislative scaffolding. What does that actually look like? Kuntz outlines a very clear policy platform. We desperately need federally subsidized, robust parental leave. We need high-quality, universally accessible, and affordable childcare.
Absolutely.
If the global economy demands that both parents work just to afford basic housing, it is collective societal insanity to not have a public infrastructure that supports child rearing while those parents are on the clock.
She also points to the vital necessity of changing male behavior, specifically by encouraging and incentivizing active, hands-on fathers. The 1950s breadwinner ideal severely isolated men from the emotional lives of their own children.
Yeah. Did
But Kuntz notes that modern sociological research is incredibly clear. When men are deeply, equally involved in the daily, messy, logistical work of child-rearing, the outcomes for the children are extraordinary.
Oh, totally.
It consistently raises boys who are far more empathetic and emotionally regulated, and it raises girls who are significantly more likely to succeed, particularly in challenging, non-traditional fields.
Furthermore, we have to fundamentally change our punitive cultural narrative around non-traditional families, especially single parents. Politicians constantly pathologize single mothers, but Kuntz shares a data point that completely upends that narrative. Studies show that adults in single-parent families actually spend more time directly talking to, engaging with, and reading to their children than adults in traditional two-parent families.
Because the single parent recognizes they are the sole line of defense, they are often intensely highly present. The problem with single parenthood is not the structure itself. It is the crushing lack of economic and social support surrounding that structure.
Right.
If we actually support single parents with good policies, if we ensure they have living wages, health care, and subsidized childcare to ease the economic terror, the data shows those kids absolutely thrive.
It reminds me of the quote Kuntz shared from her grandmother, which might be the thesis statement for this entire practical approach. She said, "Problems are sometimes opportunities in work clothes."
I love that quote.
It's so good. Yes, the breakdown of the rigid 1950s nuclear model is causing massive logistical problems and stress, but it is simultaneously an opportunity, dressed in work clothes, to build a societal architecture that is far more equitable, far more resilient, and far more honest about how human beings actually need to live.
And there is a beautiful, deeply personal, subtle benefit to implementing all of these practical reforms and embracing the chosen family.
That's that.
If we actually rebuild the village, if we treat our friends as chosen kin, if we share the burdens of care, and if we build better social safety nets, we actually relieve the suffocating, impossible pressure that is currently crushing our romantic relationships.
Oh, that is a profound observation to land on. Think about the mechanics of modern marriage. Right now, because the nuclear family is so physically and emotionally isolated, we expect our romantic partner to literally be our everything.
We demand it. We expect one human being to be our best friend, our primary financial co-manager, our flawless co-parent, our passionate, spontaneous lover, our deep dive therapist, and our entire emotional support system.
Yeah.
It is a completely impossible, superhuman burden for one mortal person to bear.
It is a guaranteed recipe for resentment, exhaustion, and eventually divorce. No one can be a village all by themselves. But if you have a vibrant, functioning, chosen family, if you have a community that shares the heavy lifting of care and emotional support, your spouse is suddenly liberated.
Yes.
They don't have to be your everything. They're free to just be your partner. The relationship finally has the oxygen to breathe. Counterintuitively, tearing down the walls of the nuclear family and embracing the village might be the exact mechanism that actually saves our marriages.
It perfectly harmonizes the theoretical and the practical.
It really does. We have been on a massive intellectual journey today. We started by looking at an institution we are told is the bedrock of humanity, and we realized it was actually a highly specific, heavily subsidized, 15-year historical anomaly.
We examined how its rigid, isolated architecture, historically built on the legal subjugation of women and currently reliant on the extraction of unwaged labor, creates a profound bottleneck of care that generates immense modern misery and inequality.
We explored Stephanie Kreutz's brilliant paradox, discovering how the injection of radical romantic love into marriage made the relationship beautiful, but made the institution inherently fragile and prone to collapse.
And we journeyed through the wide spectrum of paths forward. We moved from Sophie Lewis's radical, challenging call to communize care, abolish the concept of humans as property, and practice red love, all the way to the vital, pragmatic necessity of forging chosen families and fighting for robust, supportive social policies.
We cannot go back to the 1950s, and if we are honest about the history, we absolutely shouldn't want to. The path forward requires us to widen the lens and tear down the gates. Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your week.
Let's hear it.
If the core problem of the nuclear family is that it isolated us behind walls, and the solution, whether you are reading a radical Marxist theorist or a pragmatic moderate sociologist, is actively expanding our circle of care, what if the most radical, world-changing thing you could do this week doesn't happen inside your house but outside of it?
Oh, wow.
Take a look at your street, your apartment building, your commute. What if you chose to treat a neighbor's child, or a struggling coworker, or a friend who is drowning in logistics with the exact same non-contingent, unconditional grace and material support that you normally reserve exclusively for your own blood? If, as Sophie Lewis suggests, we're not lone individuals but rather the constant makers of each other, who are you going to make tomorrow?
That's a powerful question to end on.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the architecture of the world around you, keep looking past the myths, and we'll see you next time.